Indoctrination is the presentation of a worldview in which other ways of being are not considered. You're presenting one view to the exclusion of others. And exposure, by contrast, experiencing a wide variety of views and engaging with them. And in fact, there's so much evidence that classroom routines that are about deliberation and debate have a long-term outsized positive impact on civil tolerance. And civil tolerance doesn't mean, oh, anything goes, I'm just a relativist. No, it means having a strong belief about something, but being able to hold someone else's strong belief with respect.
Ashley, thank you so much for joining Always Learning. We appreciate you coming on today, and I am sure that I'm going to learn a lot. So thank you and welcome for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's always a joy.
So listen, you put in a lot of work to write this book, Educational Pluralism and Democracy, How to Handle Indoctrination, Promote Exposure, and Rebuild America's Schools. And this is a time right now where this is a very timely book and timely discussion that we should have, because it feels a little bit like we're falling apart. The thing that holds us together, the glue that is public education, is atomizing in some ways right now. And I don't know that we have clear answers. So you get to solve that problem for us today in this discussion. You get to solve the whole thing. Do you have an answer, Ashley? Like, can we just jump there?
Here's my 2 points. 4 points to a healthy educational system. Yes. No, I can't solve all the problems. They are many and they are diverse. And a lot of the book is taken up by saying, here's an issue. Here's how we could solve it. Here's a potential way through. And in the book, I very much took as my model the successful democracies around the world that have done things differently than we have. And what can we learn from them? What do we not want to learn from them?
And, I think it's new to Americans that not everybody does education the way that we do. So when we talk about educational pluralism, I think you and I have talked before that we're kind of an outlier in the way that we structure our schools. So how is that? Let's just talk about us being an outlier.
Yes. Yeah. So when you're raised in the United States, as I was, you were, we assume that public education is one thing. It's the district school. And you have this very clear binary of public and private. And now we have charters. But these are distinct things that are often in opposition to one another. The zoned residential assignment traditional neighborhood school is what we've known. And the interesting thing is when you wheel around the globe, you find that model of public education equals one thing is rare. That the vast majority of countries have some kind of public-private partnership for delivering education. And most of our peer democracies have long supported a wide variety of schools, religious, secular, pedagogical, philosophically distinctive, on equal grounds, and held them together by common content requirements. I'm happy to give some examples if that would be helpful.
Yeah, because I think there's a nuance, a line in the book somewhere that talks about the way that we structure. You would be turning on its head the way that we structure our schools right now. So right now, I'm going to get it wrong, but we have a lot of similar schools, but diverse content. And we would move to having a lot of different kinds of schools with a common content. Did I get that right? Yeah, I feel like I'm butchering it a little bit.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Our schools, our district schools are different from one another. We know this. There are some that are very successful and some that are not really teaching kids how to read. There's a wide variety. So I don't mean to imply that they're all the same, but there is the same delivery mechanism. It's the state funds the district funds the schools, and so forth. And it's the traditional neighborhood school. So it's what we would call in international terms, educational uniformity. At the same time, as you said, our teachers have been trained to select their own materials. Some systems have adopted textbooks. Some states have adopted textbooks. But from all that we see in the field, creating a norm within a school, even, or within a system, a norm of, hey, every child in third grade is going to learn this stuff. And how do we help teachers deliver that well? That's a kind of foreign, it's very difficult, and it's a new proposition in many of our states. So yes, pluralism flips that. It says schools can't be ideologically neutral. It's impossible.
You don't think so?
Give that up. It's not possible. I mean, anytime even writing a disciplinary code, a student handbook, the way that there's even some studies about classroom protocols, who gets called on, who doesn't get called on, those kinds of things. These are normative. They're teaching kids something. They reflect underlying assumptions, even if they're thin assumptions. And so instead of pretending that education can be ideologically neutral, we just fund a variety of schools. So the Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools on equal footing. Indonesia funds and supports a wide range of schools. Belgium, most provinces of Canada, Australia, many countries, and many countries in Africa have something analogous to charter schools. And some of these mechanisms are very, very old. In England, they date back to 1834. Others are more new. So Sweden went with this approach, or had the option of that kind of approach, about 25 years ago. So these things are in flux.
The easiest, I think, examples for people to understand are the ones that are closest to us. So Canada couldn't be any closer. And in terms of history and timeline and whatever, England couldn't be, I think, any closer. So let's just talk about those two real quick. What do our neighbors, our neighbors to the north, what do they do differently than what we do?
Well, one way they're similar is that education is really determined by the province in the way that ours are by the state. And so there are differences between the Canadian provinces. Most of them have what we would call school choice, where they make it possible for families to choose schools that meet their needs. In some cases, the Catholic and Protestant and secular schools are all directly publicly funded. And that is just the history. One of the provinces that I admire is Alberta, because Alberta did something very courageous in the 70s and 80s. They recalibrated school funding so that it wasn't contingent on property values, which is huge for equity. They funded a wider variety of schools. So they had always had Catholic, Protestant, secular schools. They began to fund Inuit schools, Islamic schools, homeschooling, more options. And they, for the first time in 100 years, put in a very tough academic curriculum that all the kids had to master. And there are a lot of differences, but to me, what was really striking about that is it was a grand bargain. They equalized funding, they expanded the kinds of schools, and the glue that holds those schools together is this common content. It's not a lockstep content, but there has to be a similarity of content that is on the assessments. And Alberta became one of the highest performing systems in the world.
And then England, they fund a variety of different types of schools, right?
When England began funding public education in the first place in 1834, it was originally channeled exclusively through community foundations. Most of them were religious. Most of them were already involved in education in some fashion. But the state supported that. The state shortly thereafter supported distinctive, philosophically and pedagogically oriented teacher prep programs. And as the demography grew and changed, they funded ever more types of schools. The curriculum side of it has waxed and waned. There have been some very low, these things are not fixed. They've had to have some recalibration of their curriculum and so forth. But England is, in the 1830s, is very similar to how our states were. We used to be pluralistic. We used to fund a wide variety of schools equally. And we lost that by the end of the 19th century.
What seems to be like really challenging about this concept, I think, is in your book you talk about France and I think Denmark and some other places, and in most of those cases they fund different types of schools, but they have something approaching a national curriculum. And it feels like there has been no bigger fight in the United States than to have a national curriculum. Like it feels like
Yes,
it's
yeah, and we
yeah.
won't, we won't, we
We
can't,
can't. I mean,
but we could, we can't. There's no federal, constitutionally, we can't do it, at least at this juncture. But what we can do is states can use the standards process to really require robust domains of knowledge. And some states have started doing this. The first to really do it was Louisiana, to require kind of common curriculum. And then they had, for a long time, they just stopped it for funding reasons, an assessment, a four stakes assessment that reflected the actual content. But there are other ways to kind of get at that. The assessment piece has to be there. And I think for equity purposes, because the assessments often drive the classroom curriculum. And so assessments that are robust, that require students to have read certain things, is a great way to signal to the field, teachers, take your time with this literature. Take your time building background knowledge about geography.
so who decides? Because that's going to be my question. All this, like, what should be involved? What should be included in what kind of becomes a canon of some sort,
Yeah.
World Fund of Information.
Mm-hmm.
So who gets to decide the world and the fund and the information part of that? And then to assess on it, I said a national curriculum seems pretty tough, but there seems to be a lot of bipartisan um, discord. Well, no, bipartisan agreement, I should say, that assessments are no longer the thing. I don't love that because I feel like for equity purposes, what you said is true. We have to have
I
data.
feel like for civil rights purposes, we have to have data. There are so many ways that our education system is going off the rails, and it's very concerning. And my hope is that an approach that says we want kids to be educated in contexts that make sense for their families, their cultural background, and so forth. That makes sense. And public funds demand public oversight. There is an appropriate role for the state. And, as to how, we have to have that piece. Most of my arguments are with libertarians who are opposed to government oversight. And I just don't see any evidence that the market alone will or could ever create excellence and equity. And so what I would envision in terms of the content is not saying thou shalt read these particular texts, but something like kids need to read a Shakespeare play in 8th grade and one in 9th grade. I'm just making this up. There need to be. I mean, it's harder with literature, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think having high quality texts and the background information to understand them should be the birthright of every child. And within that, there should be room for local communities to differentiate where something makes sense for them. So, for example, I worked a lot with Baltimore City's ELA curriculum, and they had great novels, but they did not have them well scaffolded. So we looked at we reread their novels, and this is just in high school, and helped them rescaffold their novels with background information that would help them understand it. So one of their books, I'm just going to give this example, was The Other Westmore. And the way that book had been originally scaffolded was with kind of a motley crew of skill building, disaggregated short texts that had nothing to do with Westmore's story. So when we redesigned it with their team, we built in things like, okay, the race riots in Baltimore were a core part of his young life. So we got newspaper articles from the Baltimore Sun about those riots. There was a huge mention of the crack cocaine issues in some of the major cities and of, those mayors who were taking a stand against criminalizing in that way. And all of this had to do with the story. Furthermore, Wes Moore was a Rhodes Scholar. It is completely appropriate for little kids in Baltimore City to know what the Rhodes Scholarship is. So we put in a video about it, what it means to people, and things like that that help make sense of the novel. So, it makes sense for the other Wes Moore to be one of the core texts. It might not make sense if you're in Nebraska, but you should have a really, really great core text.
Ashley, I feel like you just went completely woke on that. Yeah.
In what way?
Well,
In what
I'm
way?
laughing about it because I'm just thinking about, I would throw it back to you because you do talk about like we're experiencing a lot of fear of indoctrination in schools.
Yes.
And that fear is driving things like, well, you would look at a book like The Other Wes Moore and think that that is some social justice curriculum and, doesn't meet my values. Why are you teaching that in the schools? We should stop that,
Some of the issue is that parents have not experienced, by and large, the liberal arts curriculum. A liberal arts curriculum, which is a systematic, sequenced approach towards geography, history, math and higher math, science, literature, philosophy, religion. American parents were not given that stuff. And there's a whole story that I do talk about in my book about why. And it has to do with walking away from democratizing the liberal arts, which most first generation families wanted, in lieu of a progressive approach to just skills and process and learning how to learn. So we now have generations of adults who don't know the difference between exposure and indoctrination. So, for example, we've worked with school systems where if you talk about the 5 pillars of Islam, parents think it's indoctrination. Let me just contrast this with how most of our democratic peers manage this. All of the countries of Europe require comparative religion and ethics throughout the K-12 experience. And that's so they do this while funding a wide variety of schools. So you might go to a Jewish day school that's really trying to inform your character within a faith tradition, but you still will have to learn and demonstrate that you've learned what Hinduism believes and teaches. In history and historical studies, you need to know what Marx's theory of history was. Now, this is obviously in the upper grades, but you being exposed to and encountering ideas that you disagree with profoundly is really pedagogically important.
This is such a
and our parents need that help. And I think, so
this point is hugely important, though. So I want to sit here for a second. So, the difference between indoctrination and exposure. I think you were going there a little bit, but I just would love for you to unpack that a little bit more because I think you just said it. A lot of people are assuming that exposure is the same thing as indoctrination.
Yeah. So this is just the right conversation to be having now, because what I think of is the difference is indoctrination is the presentation of a worldview in which other ways of being are not considered. You're presenting one view to the exclusion of others. And exposure, by contrast, is encountering a wide variety of views in an age-appropriate context, of course. I've got to say that. Experiencing a wide variety of views and engaging with them. And in fact, there's so much evidence that classroom routines that are about deliberation and debate have a long-term outsized positive impact on civil tolerance. And civil tolerance doesn't mean, anything goes, I'm just a relativist. No, it means having a strong belief about something, but being able to hold someone else's strong belief with respect. And these are learned behaviors. These are learned behaviors. And in a school system, it requires a good curriculum can do a lot of that work for you. One of the things my team does when we review social studies curricula is we look for multiple perspectives in the materials themselves. But then teachers need to be supported and given professional development in how to lead those conversations. Most fundamentally, they need the support and the articulation of this view by the central office, by their principals, which then needs to go out to the parents. I can understand I think when you have one school and and parents don't have a choice about where they go. The battle over what's in those schools is fierce and unremitting. Whereas if families can say, look, I want to send my child to a school that is Catholic, a school that is Afrocentric and culturally affirming. I mean, that's the big driver of a lot of homeschooling now, is wanting your kids in an environment that feels culturally affirming. And that's the atmosphere. But the instruction is where the differentiated viewpoints comes in.
So I think I know the answer to this, but and you kind of touch on it a little bit, but how is this really different than what we have already? And I'm asking this, kind of as a curiosity, in that we have 14,000 school districts, we have 100,000 schools, we have many school boards making many different decisions about what their locals will learn and how they'll learn it. And theoretically, that is supposed to be an expression of the local values of the local community, meaning what I do in Boise is different than what I do in Oakland. And it's based upon who elects me, right, as a school board member. Um, so oftentimes in school reform conversations, we talk about the system and we talk about the education
Right.
system. And, when you investigate it, there is no the system. It's like all different kinds of things. It's different in Maine, with their tuitioning thing that they've got going on than it might be in Louisiana.
Yes.
And Louisiana has that charter thing going on. And, Indianapolis has a
Yes.
mix of charter, innovation schools, vouchers, and I think some form of interdistrict schools or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
So it feels like there's
It's very
pluralism
pluralistic.
already.
So between 1960 and where we are now, the system has indeed, in many states, become more pluralistic. Who would have thought in the early 20th century that the Supreme Court would say, under certain circumstances, vouchers are federally constitutional? But that happened, right? In the Zellman case. Charter schools are a novelty. Places like Boston, the charter schools have changed the entire trajectory for hundreds of kids. So we are more pluralistic than we used to be. I think there are two things I would say to how different is it. Number one, a system that is historically plural does not pit entire sectors against each other. So here we spend a lot of our time, which is better, district schools, charter schools. Charter schools or private schools that are funded by the government. I mean, we are, even our research is weaponized, where you have, and that's a use of time that our democratic peers that are pluralistic, they don't waste time on that. They don't compare Catholic schools and district schools. No, they don't. Their job as policymakers and leaders is to make every school the best version of itself. So they have an entirely different discourse around around this notion of they're not competitive in that way. And that's really a foreign landscape that I think we could really, really lean into, but we have to get out the other side. So we're not pluralistic yet, because number one, the variety of state laws, but also because we're still bickering about superiority. Because the assumption still is, you read it in the newspaper all the time, you've got a district school and all these mechanisms are robbing the district school. That's asking the wrong question. The question is, how do we educate the next generation? District schools are one appropriate mechanism. Private schools are another appropriate mechanism. These are means to an end, right? So that's the one big difference. The other difference, I think, is that I just keep going back to the role that a high quality curriculum plays. If there's one book to read on this, it's Natalie Wexler's book, The Knowledge Gap, that this is the big differentiator between well-resourced families and first-generation low-income families is the amount of background knowledge. So when schools don't provide that, we're going to perpetuate the achievement gaps that we have had for so long. When France had high-quality curriculum that all kids had to learn, even though they funded a wide variety of school types, they closed their achievement gaps by sixth grade. So this is the lever that certainly our team encourages every school system to pull. Like, you pull the high quality curriculum lever and good things are going to happen. You can't just drop a new curriculum in. You spend time helping teachers understand it, owning it. You support the curriculum through walkthroughs. You have to be single-minded and for a long time to have that change. But again, most of the work that we do at the Institute is school sector agnostic, basically saying, what are your teachers using? How effectively are they using it? And we've done that. We've asked those questions with charter systems, with district and state systems, and with, Catholic systems.
So it seems to me that you're picking a fight with two different sides with everybody. You're just like, you're picking a fight with everybody. So to the
Yes.
right, I can hear I can hear people jumping off the train the moment you start talking about a common curriculum and assessments. And also,
Yes.
like, this is what got me to jump off of the school choice train. I was like the biggest barn burner kind of Jim Jones of it all. Like I was that guy. But the thing that made me jump off is when you started talking about using public money to fund schools where they didn't have to agree to civil rights protections for students.
No. No, that's the civil rights protections for
that
students.
has to be
Are you talking about LGBTQ
yeah, that has
kids?
to be.
Yes.
So on the right,
Yes.
they'll jump off of
Yes.
your train the moment you say any type of regulations, because what they say about Louisiana, for instance, is that the reason that the voucher program isn't as successful is because it has
I know.
regulations. And then to the left of you, the moment you start talking about religious schools being included, the kind of nerve that they have around the separation of church and state will be aggravated. So this is where they both will jump off the train. The right will jump off of any
That's right.
regulation, and the left will jump off. I think there may be other ways, but they will jump off on public money for religious schools specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of mythology around that too. And, that we have separation of church and state, so it's not constitutional, but most of the mechanisms are constitutional. Tax credits are constitutional, because that's not even public funds in the first place, just the way the mechanisms work. But you're absolutely right. And on the right, you have a lot of conservative voices. Like, I'm thinking of Mike Petrilli, who really support guardrails, and then who are more kind of pluralists, as it were. And then you have the libertarians who really believe that the market can sort all this out. And so it's that side. On the other hand, the civil rights is very important, and I should differentiate. In the book, I do spend a lot of time talking about why racially discriminatory schools are illegal and should never be, funded legally and so forth. And there's a lot of jurisprudence on that. The LGBTQ plus issue is one that I care a lot about personally. And I am very comfortable with a federal law that says you can't discriminate against kids for their sexual orientation or gender identity. I'd be completely on board with that. The laws are not there yet. And they're just not there yet. But I could see that coming. And I could even put it differently. It's incredibly discouraging to be in groups of people who make that issue the most important issue for a school.
And clearly, I hate to keep saying the same thing, but it is the reason why I jumped off of the school choice train, is when I saw that was not going to be a point of agreement, that, all schools should have to abide by civil rights protections for students. And the point that you're making, that I think I agree with too, that is also universally going to be scandalized, which is the idea that we should have some data come back about what we're investing in, whether or not it's working. I mean, putting a bunch of money into
That's right.
education programs that have no data, I think in the long run, that's a recipe for a very ignorant populace at some point in us going, wait, how's this happening? Well, it's happening because you have no measurements, no benchmarks, no standards.
100%, 100%. And it's irresponsible. If you're talking about the public trust, preparing the next generation is one of the most important things that a country can do. And there's no other example of government funding that I can think of that doesn't have some kind of guardrails and restrictions appropriately. I mean, we don't test them enough, but there are a lot of reasons why a pure market approach is unlikely to succeed in the things we want from schools.
Yeah, we just don't have any evidence that markets are better than anything, because markets are what give you, payday lending, and overabundance of liquor stores.
That's right. And remember, too, that we're not operating as a country from high expectations. And our expectations in judging quality are pretty modest. And it's to the disadvantage of our kids,
That's
right?
So generous the way that you put that. That's so generous. It's modest.
I mean, it's, listen, it's a tragedy that we, I look with so much envy upon my colleagues in school systems that really set a high bar. And they have the virtuous cycles of teachers. I mean, forget about teachers. To get out of high school, you have to pass exit exams. It's content specific. And true, you can differentiate earlier and go to a vocational track rather than a university track. But there's a point, even whether it's in 8th or 9th grade, where you have to demonstrate that you have learned this content. So those future teachers who pass the high school exit exams, go to university, they have to major in a subject. They have to know it inside and out. They're not majoring in teaching math. They're majoring in math. And then they have 1 year of teacher prep program, postgraduate. So by the time those teachers step into the classroom, their understanding of what education is all about has been informed by their own experience, which is richer than ours.
So if you look at a person like Diane Ravitch would now say, and with Diane, you have to always talk about which era. So like which decade of Diane. But I think the thread through all of her work is that there was a time when the public school was the common school, created a liberal education to the point where your plumber would have read Shakespeare and Macbeth, and your welder and your doctor and everybody going through a common system would have learned a liberal arts education. So she envisions a public school system that could do that. She talks about the public schools in Houston that she attended that were just like that. When did it become an idea that the schools, that just the common knowledge that were being taught to very different kinds of Americans coming through public schools, that was somehow indoctrination? Because it feels like it feels like there was always this cranky group of people on the sidelines that, thought that we took Jesus out of the schools. But other than them,
Well, this is what education was. Yeah. So, yes, that's a really good question. So, in our country, the real debate about, and Diane Ravitch is the best at chronicling this. Her book, Left Back, is a massive tome, and she chronicles in very painful detail the leaching out of content from American education. In fact, and I quote her a lot in the book, that the real story of 20th century American education is the turning away from the liberal arts, the intentional ideological commitment to process the skills of learning how to learn, the skills of finding the main idea. This went through many iterations, but there was actually at the end of the 19th century a big debate about this. We're expanding access to education. What's the content of education? And you had one very clear voice that said we democratize the liberal arts. That side lost to the progressive pedagogy, and it's not progressive in a political sense, but progressive pedagogy of let the students' interests guide it's oppressive to have common content. We want to teach kids process. So when you have major movements like that, it takes time before there's a tipping point in the field. So in the early 20th century, you have plenty of teachers in the classrooms who had a liberal arts education. By the 30s, 40s, 50s, those teachers were leaving the field, and you had younger teachers who had not had that experience themselves, who were trained in the new colleges of education, that it was all about developmental psychology. That was the esoteric knowledge that set teachers apart, not content. And so, by the time my mother was graduating from high school, and she graduated from high school in 1960, the subject matter was pretty thin already by then. And so you already had the differentiation between family background. That's when family background becomes so critical, because the schools aren't changing the trajectory. And, it's a fascinating and tragic story. And all I can say is I'm very happy that we have the Knowledge Matters campaign now. I'm very happy that we have Natalie Wexler's book. I'm very happy that, we have some research about the impact of core knowledge language arts and some of the richer, more challenging curriculum. And it again, teacher behavior is going to have to change. You probably saw TNTP's report of the opportunity myth, that if you were from a low-income family, your chance of being given grade-level assignments is, 20%?
Even when the kids are qualified for it. You have
kids.
kids sitting in classrooms that are qualified to have grade-level material, and they are still being offered below their grade-level material. Yeah, so it's not challenging them. I have one big question that, I've waited to get to a little bit. In my mind, it's a big question. But before we get there, I just want to take an example in my mind that that gives me a lot of heartburn, and it's Florida. So when you look at Florida, I've pointed out that Florida is the choiciest market in the country. It is the most educational pluralist state in the country in terms of just the vast number of offerings and what parents have access to. So you have choice. You have all these different kinds of schools, but you have a governor who outlaws entire thought systems, right? So you have choice, but you don't have a choice of what you learn. So that's my...
And we've seen the consequences
Absolutely.
of that. We have seen the
But
consequences
that's my cautionary tale that kind of divides me now from school choice people. I was a big school choice guy, but it was the most choicey state in the country.
Pluralism is not just school choice. And, the pluralism has the choice by design and accountability by design built in. And so school choice is not enough to get to where we want to go. There are two things with Florida that I would say, and we work a lot with Florida. I was very happy with their tax credit programs. The tax credit programs have been studied. They have a positive impact on the low-income kids who were able to access private schools. There were all kinds of special education schools that sprang up to meet particular needs. They have shifted, as you know, to a universal ESA approach with scant guardrails. So I have heartburn about that. I am worried about that. I don't think that's a good move. And then on top of that, you have the government trying to control content. And the use of power in that way is problematic. It doesn't matter if it's someone from the right or someone from the left. The whole point of having a pluralistic system with accountability is to make sure that if you want to found a critical race theory school, you can. You can.
Well, the lights just went
and
off
you
in
just
half
have
of
to
America.
you just be honest about it. Say, in the same way that you do catechesis, you teach kids in that school, in the critical race theory school, there is one predominant issue going on in human history, and that is race. Full stop. And it has consequences here and consequences there. I would say that schools should still have to expose kids to other ways of interpreting history. It would, other ways of understanding the world. But they don't have to teach those other ways as truth. That's the goal. So that you don't have someone controlling in the way that the state tries to control.
So to that point, when you say that there should be some common content in different types of schools, that common content has to be decided by somebody. Who decides? Well, actually, this leads to my bigger question of how do we operationalize this? Let's say that whoever comes into the White House next year reads your book and says to themselves, "Oh my God, she's really onto something. I'm going to call her, invite her up to the Capitol here. We're going to talk about this." How do you operationalize your system?
Yeah. So the first place I would go is to create better requirements around the federal testing protocols are very restrictive. They will not give title funds to states that don't have compliance with certain metrics in their state assessments. And so it's very hard from a funding perspective to actually design a knowledge-rich test. We did it in Louisiana. We were part of that team, but it was onerous, it was expensive, and there's a downward pull because it has to be calibrated to the skills-based tests. The federal government could go a long way by saying, states, these are the kinds of assessments that we would look favorably on. And have the assessments, and this is the difference between having a prescribed curriculum and having big bands of knowledge, domain knowledge. So you could say, for example, kids, and this is the state standards. Suppose you're in Florida and you say every child in the 10th grade is going to study, I'm making this up, 20th century United States poetry and literature, and have a semester on African literature, for example. There can be differential selection of that. But on the assessment, the kids are going to be asked to write an essay about 20th century U.S. literature and African literature. Based on what you've read, what do you think about this? That's an adult education that gives common understandings. And literature is the most difficult. In history, you specify which capitals. I mean, how many Americans don't even know where the Persian Gulf is and why it's important, right? But that's an important thing to vote on. So that's what I would do. I would say you operationalize it at the federal level by creating more flexibility around assessments and still requiring assessments. And then states being like John White did in Louisiana. Here are 3 great textbooks you can choose from. You can choose anything that you want. It's a local control state, but we're going to make it easy for you to do these 3 high quality curricula. And here's the assessment that this curriculum will set you up to do well in this assessment. But it's not lockstep. It's not lockstep.
What's the innovation though? Because I'm trying to separate what happens now from what would be a new idea. So right now you have state standards in social studies, in math, and reading, or English language arts. Those standards are supposedly aligned to the assessments that you give, because assessments,
well, they are. They
yeah.
are, but the problem is the assessments are terrible.
Okay.
And the curricular standards are terrible, especially in ELA. I mean, in math, at least you demonstrate knowledge of content by doing the skills of multiplication.
Mm-hmm.
But in ELA, it is vastly different to ask fifth graders to explain what the implications of a given text are. And well, I can give you a great example. I did some PD for a large district on 8th grade social studies, and the text was the Declaration of Human Rights. This is incredibly rich text. The way that the standards alignment movement operates with that text is to say, what does this word mean? What does this word mean? What's the main idea of this paragraph? What you really want to do with a text like that is pull back and say, okay, the US was a signatory to this. Why is it ironic that we were signatories when we had racially segregated, public transportation in our country? Or what had just happened that we needed to who thinks that human rights don't exist? What had just happened on the world stage in the 1940s that was living proof that we had to make a stand on this? Those are the big questions that you want kids to be thinking about as they're engaging with this. But the very meticulous, find the main idea is rendering richness too small.
Yeah.
So the standards are a problem many, many times. Now, some states are starting to rewrite their standards to be more content rich, and good things can happen from that.
Yeah, it feels like the standards has been kind of like an eternal thing that we've tried to rework state by state. So in my state, I can think of probably like 3 distinct eras of what the standards were. And they got more expansive, and then they got more kind of, closed down depending on who the governor was at different times. So to the question around how you operationalize, I feel like there would probably be some sort of national council or some sort of national group that would come together to think through what you just said about, like, what does create the rich kind of understanding of these texts that we want them to know and whatever. So that's one thing. You need like a national council. It seems to me like years ago, like all the governors came together multiple times around things. In the Clinton era, in the Reagan era, in the George Bush era, governors came together and they kind of wield the power, like, of their states. So it's good for them to get together and agree on some things. So it feels like you would need them to read your book, for one. So maybe we start there. We send your book to all of the governors of the United States,
But I would, from your lips to God's ears. But I also think there's a real opportunity in some of the states where the kind of zero-sum game has just worn everyone out. And certainly I've been part of some off-the-record conversations in a wide array of states where what's been on the table has been, first of all, we're going to put our weapons down. We're not going to diminish entire sectors anymore. Number 2, we're going to recalibrate our funding mechanisms so that it prioritizes instruction, teaching and learning. And we're going to create the conditions under which every district school, every charter school, every private school has access to content institutes, to, there are ways to do this at the state level. We're going to create partnerships across sectors. And, those are the kinds of conversations that are happening where you have school choice in some of these states I'm talking about, but you also have a majority of kids, as ever, in district schools. And the question is, how do you lower the temperature so that in states like that, we're not condemning entire sectors? We're not talking about how charter schools rob districts, but we're able to create the conditions for every school to improve.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that's possible. I don't think it's possible at scale right now because of the political punishment in many states for policymakers who are able to compromise. But that's what we desperately need.
Yeah. In my own life, I have kids in traditional public schools. I've been a charter parent and a private school parent before. Our family has had to make decisions about, our kids based upon our kids, like, what was going on with them in their life.
Yeah.
But what I will say is, as somebody who was in the libertarian camp very fully, and probably one of the ones that frustrated you when I was in my full heyday of that libertarian side of things, I've come around on this idea that I'd rather live in a blue state where we're arguing about charter schools than move my Black family to a red state where they have outlawed Black books and outlawed Black thought systems and outlawed Black scholarship. Like, I could not move my family to Florida.
No.
Like, Florida's just a no-go for me. So I live in Minnesota. We're the liberal of the liberal, I think, in some ways. We're the only state that didn't go for Reagan, right? The only one. So, this is a bastion of, I think, kind of progressive thought in some ways. And I would rather what we have here. We do have charter schools, and we're the birthplace of charter schools, but
That's
it
right.
is constantly an argument. Like, it is like the argument between the charter. What you say about demonizing a sector is very true here. That happens. But I can live with that more than I can live with what is really alarming to me, which is content restrictions that are along the lines of race. And that seems to be the ESA way. The ESA way seems to be sold as like an anti-woke escape hatch for families that don't want their kids learning that Martin Luther King was a great guy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it certainly is not comfortable for me to view school choice mechanisms as an escape hatch from content you don't like.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are two things. The one is the school environment, and the other is the instructional core. Those are separate things. And, I do think it's unfortunate that that's the way some of these mechanisms have been pitched.
Mm-hmm. I think it's actually works against what they want. In the long run, that's going to come back.
Yeah.
And,
In the long run, we human beings should not have that level of control over others in a free society.
So what state gets closest to your vision? Like, what state do you think you have the most hope in?
I mean, I like Indiana for all the reasons that you said. And they've always had a testing mandate for private schools, even when they don't receive funds from the state. And that's because of the way to play athletics, you have to test. I think Indiana's really got a lot of good things going for it. Obviously, in places like Massachusetts, the charter sector is fantastic. We do work with an awful lot of the private school systems in Florida, and I've liked the schooling approach where the funding goes to a school. I'm again worried about what will happen with the ESAs.
Massachusetts always rises to the top of every kind of list of things. And you just mentioned they get charters more right than most anybody else does. But that's because they regulate them in a way where,
they regulate them.
They regulate for it. Indiana, as you just said, seems to be the understudied thing. They're just quietly, humbly doing these really great things and putting systems in place where you have lots of pathways to where you want to get. But they all lead, in some ways, in my mind, I don't know if they would say this, but they all lead to college or to training or to a career or to some way of living your life, like having the skills that you need.
Yeah, I agree with you. And what's so impressive is they have these organizations like the Mind Trust that are not political. They're not fighting political battles, but they're just quietly bringing in competent people, helping communities create their own schools that work for their neighborhoods. They partner with the district. They partner, they partner with Purdue. Something like that.
You know what I love about
sits
them
really
so much
well.
is that because they have that ecosystem going, the district has its own innovation schools. They're kind of like inspired to do something different themselves. So they have their own schools that are kind of like, free schools to do whatever they want, but, more autonomy, but they still have to be tested. They still have to do the standard stuff. So
All of them do.
there's so much to unpack in your book, and I love it. And I know that we're coming to wrap here. I would just ask you to say what you think are the big ideas, and what did you learn as you were writing this book? Because I feel like before you wrote this book, and I talked to you while you were writing the book, you already learned a lot about education pluralism, and your previous book is like the best I read in the 2-year period that I had that book. It was the best thing I read. Like it informed kind of my thinking probably more than anything else in that period of time. So, then you go off and you write another book. What did you learn out of the first one that was different that, created this new body of work that you did?
So the new work is really focused on curriculum more than just the pluralism theory. And that's sort of my plea that at the very least, whatever kind of school you go to or whatever kind of school you run, the highest quality knowledge building curriculum will make a difference. So I really was able to integrate some of the research that we've done at the Institute, some of the work that I've read from around the globe. I would say the other thing is that I have realized in the process of writing that book, I have become very involved in UNESCO and some of the international conversations about schools. And as a matter of fact, I was in Geneva a few weeks ago with a kind of working group on regulating non-state actors in education. And I hadn't realized that the United States arguments are being marshaled, and not in a good way internationally. So, for example, this calling a charter school or a private school tax credit, calling it privatization. It's a pejorative term. You're privatizing instead of saying, hey, this is the way most countries do it. It's a negative terminology, and that language is being exported all over the world. And it's very well funded. And so I work with colleagues from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from Europe, and in some of the lower income or developing countries are under a tremendous amount of pressure from some of these movements. So, the United States politics and the really negative aspects of our polarization and our demonization of one another is having a terrible effect on the world's conversations.
Yeah.
And that's been very upsetting for me and something I'm trying to push back on in those conversations.
Yeah, but what makes you hopeful? Like, why do you still get up in the morning?
What makes me hopeful is that I get to work with systems that are really trying to do right by their kids. Sometimes those systems are states or districts. Sometimes they're charter systems. Sometimes they're Catholic systems or Islamic schools, Jewish day schools. There are a lot of good things happening.
Yeah.
It's not all dark.
I feel like that's like one of the points for us to constantly remember. We're lurching back and forth between left and right in ways that's discombobulating our ability to think rationally. And when you dig in with schools and districts, they are not evil. They're composed of people, and a lot of people who come to work every day thinking that they're going to fix things or they're going to do something good. And it gets frustrating over time for them because they really are trying to do something, even when they're failing. They are trying to do something that they think is going to make a difference. As a school board member, I remember thinking I went in with a lot of predetermined stereotypes and ideas about what was going on in the school system. And then when I got there and I saw the people, I didn't agree with them on everything, but I just could see that they were so earnest in every day they were trying to do better. And sometimes the system was
Yes.
working against them, you know.
I think that's a really good word. I think that education could do with a big dose of humility, and we get a lot farther. I mean, some people are never going to be convinced on the fringes, but most people who want schools to succeed.
Well, how can people find you, Ashley?
So you can write to me at my address, which is ashley.berner@jhu.edu. My books are on Amazon, and the new book is now in audio. It's on Kindle and Audible, all those things. And just happy to have a conversation with anyone who'd like it.
So, governors, school district leaders, call Ashley. Well, thank you as always. I think the work is brilliant and much needed at a time when we are so polarized. You find a way to kind of drive it right up the middle to a logical place, and that's rare. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your support and your wisdom along the way. It was very important to me that I could talk these things through
I
with
appreciate
you.
that.
So thank you for all that you do.
I love to support it.
And well, thanks for all that you do to support the next generation, Chris. I mean,
I appreciate you. Everybody listening and watching, this has been another episode of Always Learning. As always, share the show, swap it around, leave a review, give it a good rating. Do all you can for us. So we appreciate you. We'll see you on the next episode.